Did you know that the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department of the Japanese Imperial Government during World War II conducted human experimentation on a scale that matched or even exceeded Nazi medical crimes? This is the story of Unit 731, a covert biological warfare division where prisoners were dissected alive, infected with the plague, and used as nothing more than disposable test subjects. And yet, unlike their German counterparts, the people behind Unit 731 never faced justice. And obviously, some of the German counterparts were turned into paper clips. So I wouldn't call that facing justice, but anyways. So why is that? Why would the world turn a blind eye to these crimes against humanity, and just how far did the human experimentation go during World War II? Not only among the Axis powers, but among the Allies as well. From its inception, much of Unit 731 would be shrouded in secrecy and attempts to mislead people from knowing that it was created to develop and test biological weapons. This Japanese biological warfare unit, operating under the innocuous name Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department, conducted human experimentation on a scale that matched or exceeded the Nazi medical crimes. 731 even recruited children as young as 14 years old into the unit, which had over 10,000 members of staff, all under the guise that they'd be assisting research aimed at preventing people from getting sick. But this was another deception. The unit was responsible for immeasurable human suffering, and not just preventing people from getting sick. Unit 731 emerged from Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii's conviction that biological weapons that were banned by the 1925 Geneva Protocol must be devastatingly effective. After reading the prohibition, Ishii reasoned that international law would not ban weapons unless they posed extraordinary military value. Why ban something if it wasn't the best at its intended purpose? That is what Dr. Ishii wanted to explore, and his background and connections would allow him to do. Ishii was a military man with a medical background. He was a Japanese microbiologist who had graduated from Kyoto Imperial University's medical department before joining the Japanese military, where he'd become a surgeon first lieutenant. While at university, he'd impressed the president of the school, Araki Toraseburo, and even married his daughter, solidifying his position as a man of medical science. One might think that as a man of medical science, he'd appreciate what the Geneva Conventions were trying to achieve, that is, humane treatment of POWs and the banning of chemical and biological weapons during World War I as a result of what was learned in World War I, but Ishii felt the opposite because he was a psychopath. For more context, there were several major international agreements that are relevant when discussing the atrocities of Unit 731 and why they were just outlawed. You're not supposed to do this stuff, especially not during the more advanced times of World War II. These agreements include the 1907 Hague Convention, the 1922 treaty relating to the use of submarines and noxious gases in warfare, the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which prohibited asphyxiation, poisoning, and chemical and biological warfare, and the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of POWs. The 1907 Hague Convention was one of the first attempts to seek humane treatment for prisoners of war. The 1922 treaty relating to the use of submarines and noxious gases in warfare is a treaty that would have gone into effect if the 5 victors of World War I, which were the US, UK, France, Italy, and Japan, had all ratified it, but France never ratified it, which is bizarre. Japan then participated in drafting the 1925 protocol, but never signed it. And while it did sign the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of POWs, it failed to ratify that. So, in effect, Japan positioned itself outside the very international norms it helped to shape for the rest of the world, which left them little legal barrier to the horrors that would later unfold under Unit 731 during World War II. Part of Ishii's justification for his actions may have been the fact that the only other major world power that would refuse to ratify the 1925 Geneva Protocol was the United States, which wouldn't do so until April 10th, 1975. Therefore, we, the US, must have had biological weapons and were prepared to use them. That is the idea, I suppose. These agreements were drafted in the wake of World War I, then called the Great War, because of the atrocities that were committed during the war, such as the German army's use of chemical weapons on civilian populations, causing civilian deaths when winds carried gases to nearby villages and towns close to the front lines. Though Ishii was not horrified with this, he was quite impressed. He was a f***ing psycho. This guy was crazy. Look at this. This guy was insane. Ishii wanted to test the limits of the human body to various conditions, pathogens, and chemicals. But first, he needed a place to operate and people to operate both with and on. You can't just go on the street and ask somebody to be complicit with such things, and you cannot go on the street and ask somebody if they want to be a result of such things that others would potentially be complicit upon and acting upon you, or whatever. Ishii established a base of operations at an army medical facility in Tokyo, Japan, obviously. Say that. But this arrangement would be short-lived because in the heart of Japanese society, there were few subjects on whom to conduct his experiments. There wasn't a lot of people who were willing to do this. Over time, they would maintain a presence in Tokyo, but needed facilities and more access to test subjects. This brings us to the Second Sino-Japanese War, and this would be the answer to Ishii's problems. The Second Sino-Japanese War went from 1937 to 1945, and during this period, Japan, seen by the West as Asia's most advanced nation, had occupied roughly 25% of China's territory and over a third of the population. For clarity, Japan's imperialism began in the 1800s, and they really did not like China at all. And Japan had occupied regions of China before the Second Sino-Japanese War, such as Manchuria, which was operated as a Japanese puppet state and called Manchukuo. That was since 1932. And in Manchukuo is where things would begin in earnest. The Togo unit was the pilot piece of what would become Unit 731. They began with a feasibility study to see if experiments on human subjects, in this case, they were Chinese prisoners, would yield results and in turn lead this type of experimentation to be seen as a worthwhile investment for the Japanese military. The Togo unit was a small undertaking compared to what Unit 731 would eventually become, with roughly 10 military doctors and aiding staff operating in secret under fake names in the purview of the Kwantung Army. A while later, in 1936, is when Unit 731 became officially recognized in a memo titled Opinion Regarding the Reinforcement of Military Forces in Manchuria, and Emperor Hirohito personally approved the establishment of Unit 31. Unit 731, still called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit, could scale up its operation and become headquartered in a new laboratory at a hospital in Harbin. At the same time, an even larger facility was being constructed in Pingfan. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese Minister of War from 1940 to 1941 and Prime Minister until 1944, served as the head of the Kempeitai, which was a military police arm of the Imperial Japanese Army during this time. While Hideki Tojo was later held responsible for the murder of millions of Chinese civilians, it's alleged that his Kempeitai in Manchuria were tasked with sourcing research materials from the streets for Unit 731. These were political prisoners, criminals, the poor, and the homeless. Those were often the most targeted. The facility at Pingfang completed in 1939 and sprawled across 6 square kilometers with an estimated 150 buildings and thousands of staff at its peak, rivaling Auschwitz-Birkenau in physical scale. The structures included laboratories, operating rooms, military barracks, cremation facilities, and jails with capacity for holding 600 prisoners at a time on whom they would experiment. As facility space expanded, so did the on-site staff, and as the program evolved, so did the background of those responsible for conducting these experiments. While the Togo unit had been comprised of military doctors, the research staff would soon be sourced from private institutions. In the spring of 1938, a group of researchers consisting of 2 bacteriologists, 3 pathologists, 2 physiologists, and a researcher that specialized in animal testing arrived from Kyoto Imperial University, which is the same school from which Ishishiro had graduated and that he'd married into the people who ran it. The researchers who refused to participate would be labeled as hikokumen, which is a traitor, effectively ending their medical careers, and still most saw their work as service to the emperor, and the taking of non-Japanese lives to them at the time meant nothing. Unit 731 had a budget that was seemingly unlimited for the time. Annual budget of 10 million yen, which is approximately 9 billion yen today, or 86 million American dollars. Wow. Exceeded that of many legitimate medical research institutions of this era, and their equipment was state-of-the-art. This also allowed the program to expand with the war as more Chinese cities fell to Japanese occupation and more sister units were installed within them. In 1938, Unit 1855 was established in Beijing, and in 1939, Unit 1644 was established in Nanjing and Unit 8604 in Guangzhou. Then in 1942, Unit 9420 was established in Singapore. Some estimates believe that there could have been as many as 26 experimental detachments and units across Japanese-occupied land in Asia. And staff among those sites are rumored to have ranged from 10,000 to 20,000. all of which were under the control of Ishishiro. This was an industrial-scale biological weapons program, but most people have just never heard of it. How is that even possible? Unit 731 alone was organized into 8 divisions, with each division serving a specific function, such as Division 1 conducted pathogen research using live subjects, Division 2 developed biological weapon delivery systems, Division 3 produced shells containing biological agents, and Division 4 maintained mass bacteria production facilities capable of generating 300 kilograms of plague bacteria monthly. Division 5 trained personnel, and Divisions 6 through 8 were dedicated to equipment, sort of maintenance style, or to maintaining medical and administrative units. This was a perversion on an industrial scale. Once again, victims were entirely dehumanized. And once again, as a reminder, while officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit for the Kwantung Army, what they said they were to locals of Pingfang was another lie entirely. If the people of Pingfang knew what was happening, it wouldn't have gone over well, obviously, so instead, they told locals that the facility was a lumber mill. And to maintain this dehumanizing mischaracterization of the nature of Unit 731, researchers and staff began referring to their victims as maruda, which is the Japanese word for log. So they weren't killing people, they were simply cutting down trees. It even became a joke among researchers. Reading about this and researching it, it makes me wonder if this dehumanization was a sort of defense mechanism amongst some of the researchers, because they couldn't do what they were going to do and still be human. It was pure evil. One quote from a Unit 731 researcher reveals the mental gymnastics and indoctrination performed to justify what they were doing to themselves and their colleagues. This is the full quote. Our God-given mission as doctors is to challenge all varieties of disease-causing microorganisms, to block all roads of intrusion into the human body, and to annihilate all foreign matter resident to our bodies, and to devise the most expeditious treatment possible. However, the research upon which we are now about to embark is the complete opposite of many of these principles and may cause us some anguish as doctors. Nevertheless, I beseech you to pursue this research based on the double medical thrill. 1, a scientist to exert effort into probing the truth in natural science and research into and discovery of the unknown world, and 2, as a military person to successfully build a powerful military weapon against the enemy. I mean, what the f? They called it research, but what it was that we see now is systematic torture and the most unimaginable human suffering possible to conjure up. The biological weapons testing program infected thousands with plague, cholera, hemorrhagic fever, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, and dysentery, among many others. Researchers referred to victims as medically usable specimens, and these deliberate infections were to be studied at all levels of progression, and they did so through vivisection, which, if you don't know what that is, it is the practice of performing surgery on a live animal for research or experimental purposes. And some of these vivisection procedures were conducted without anesthesia to avoid data contamination. They subjected men, women, and pregnant women to live dissection. Organs were removed for examination to study the effects of a progressing disease before death to avoid any form of decomposition spoiling the research. Shiro Ishii would even perform vivisections himself. Subjects were strapped to operating tables with towels stuffed in their mouths to muffle their screams while researchers cut into them. Pregnant women would be vivisected to show how the fetus was developing and if the infections affected the mother and the fetus differently. And they didn't just kidnap pregnant women. Women were involuntarily impregnated, sometimes by doctors, before being subjected to experimentation. And as Unit 731 also experimented with and the spread of sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis, male prisoners with syphilis were ordered to other prisoners, both male and female alike, so that the disease could be studied. Reportedly, one time a pregnant woman who was being vivisected told the doctor, "It's all right to kill me, but please spare my child's life." Then there were frostbite experiments led by physiologist Yoshimura Hisato. These involved submerging prisoners' limbs in ice water until they were frozen solid. They wanted to test the human response to freezing temperatures as well as the body's ability to bounce back from an extreme freezing point. They observed how long it took to develop frostbite and when a coat of ice formed over the skin, it was deemed frozen enough, and when struck with a cane, the limbs would even make a sound similar to a plank of wood. Researchers also tested various thawing methods, determining that water between 100 and 122 Fahrenheit proved optimal. Still, they also tried other methods such as no treatment at all to see how long it would take for the victim's natural blood flow to thaw the limb, or they tried blasting it with open flames. Babies as young as 3 months were subjected to frostbite experiments with temperature sensing needles. They could record internal temperatures as they froze. The findings of Unit 731 regarding the ideal water temperature to thaw limbs were later used by US military medical personnel, and with military medicine guidelines recommending 104 Fahrenheit water immersion. This was not the only appropriation of the 731 findings. We will get further into that later in the video. Victims were also used to test the operational range of various types of conventional weapons. They were tied to stakes before being blasted by flamethrowers, grenades, and other explosive devices. Then they studied shrapnel injuries that were a result of the grenade, shell, and bomb tests. They studied bullet wounds too. Pressure chamber experiments subjected victims to increasing atmospheric pressure until their eyes protruded from their sockets. Centrifuges were used to spin victims at high speeds, simulating what pilots were subjected to until the prisoners died. Prisoners were also hanged upside down to test how long it took to choke to death. Air was injected into arteries to study embolisms, and limbs would be amputated and reattached to the opposite side of the body just to see what would happen. As you could probably surmise, it became a culture of experimentation, horrific experimentation within Japan's military medical system. One doctor who participated in some of the experiments at Unit 731's base in Harbin, Ken Yuasa, would later state, "It wasn't just my experience, it was done everywhere." Prisoners weren't the only ones subjected to the cruelty of testing biological weapons and chemical weapons. Earlier, we mentioned the other sister units that spawned from the Unit 731 program, with Nanjing's Unit 1644 being among them. Ultimately, what good is the testing of weapons like this if you aren't actually going to use them? At least that was the mentality of the Japanese military during World War II. So, the weapons developed by the Ishii network would eventually be tested in the field, with Unit 1644 serving as the forward base for attacks on Chinese cities supplied by pathogens which were manufactured by Unit 731. Japan's biological warfare program killed between 200 and 580,000 Chinese civilians through experimentation, as well as systematic pathogen attacks on Chinese cities. The U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command speculates that the number of Chinese civilians killed by Japanese biological weapons was over 500,000. There were 12 large-scale field trials conducted in at least 11 Chinese cities, with fleas infected with the bubonic plague that had been bred by Unit 731's labs and delivered to Unit 1644 were spread by low-flying airplanes over Ningbo and Changde, as well as parts of the Zhejiang province, killing tens of thousands of people. Also, an unintended consequence was the infection and subsequent deaths of over 1,700 Japanese soldiers exposed to pathogens like cholera. An attack was launched against Jinhua a month after the attack on Ningbo, when countermeasures had been taken in response to previous biological attacks. And when Japanese planes dropped small granules the size of small shrimp eggs, they were gathered and examined, which revealed the plague-bearing bacteria without a resulting breakout. It was one of several failures and attacks against Chinese cities that resulted in delivery systems being reworked. This is when pathogen-loaded bombs and shells were developed, which would allow the Japanese military to deliver pathogens and destruction to target areas that their attacking troops hadn't moved into yet, keeping their people safe from infection. Biological weapons weren't just used against the Chinese. They were also used against Soviet troops. And as the Soviet Union had approached the border of Mongolia and Japan-occupied Manchuria, the Japanese fought them and lost. In an attempt to hinder the Soviet advance after the loss, large quantities of typhoid bacteria were deposited in a river running through a desert where water was scarce. It's just pure evil. Unit 731 was attached to the Kwantung Army, hence the name Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department of the Kwantung Army. So, in the wake of their defeat, it makes sense that they would try to intervene and just infect a bunch of people, I don't know, Japanese style. That all being said, whether out of incompetence or out of a desire to just cause fear rather than death, they deployed the typhoid pathogen in that river, which typhoid becomes almost entirely ineffective in water, so it really didn't do anything. But it was potentially psychological warfare. I'm not exactly sure. I wasn't alive then. Several planned attacks never came to fruition due to several factors. According to the Warfare History Network, they had planned to launch 150 million insects during the siege of Bataan, but the battle had ended by the time the plague-carrying fleas were ready. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, 2 pathogen-carrying gliders were going to be launched against the invading Americans, but the gliders never reached their destination. Plague-carrying fleas were planned to be used against Americans during the Battle of Saipan, but the Japanese submarine carrying them was sunk before arriving. And similarly, in Okinawa, Americans were to be the target of another plague flea attack, but the fleas could not be delivered in time. It is crazy how often they tried to use plague fleas to kill people. Then we have Cherry Blossoms at Night, which was the name of a plot to enact a biological attack against American cities in California in a suicide mission where 5 aircraft carrying submarines containing a total of 15 float planes would spread bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and dengue fever over San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. There would have been no course to return home, as the submarines themselves would be full of infected crews who would run themselves into the shore, presumably to be captured and spread disease among their captors, but the plan never came to fruition as it was scheduled to take place after the eventual surrender of Japan in the wake of the dropping of the atomic bombs. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night would have been a retaliatory attack, which would be their way of getting back at the US for firebombing Japanese cities. This is pre-atomic bombs, obviously, which those firebombs killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians that were killed as a result of the atomic bombs as well. The Japanese thirst for revenge was so intense that Ishii wanted to continue with the suicide mission even after their surrender to the Allied powers. Still, it never happened due to opposition from his superiors who didn't wish to see him die in a suicide attack. What an odd group of people. While both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan conducted extensive human experimentation, their programs differed significantly in scope, methods, and underlying motivation. Nazi medical experiments involved approximately 15,750 documented victims, with another 12,000 potential but unconfirmed victims across 70 programs in 15 different camps in Germany, with an estimated 4,364 direct deaths as a result of these camps throughout Germany and Poland and just, occupied Europe, I should say. In contrast, Unit 731 killed at least 12,000 people in laboratory settings alone, potentially much higher, with the total deaths from biological warfare attacks reaching 200 to 580,000. The Nazi programs employed approximately 200 physician participants, while Unit 731's network involved over 10,000 personnel. It's wild. It's wild that this is the... But for some reason, the primary focus in our history teaching is that the Nazis were the kings of all of this stuff. Even in America, which for America, the Pacific theater was more important than the European theater. So all that's a little bit confusing, but anyways. In German experimentation, there were more who survived than were killed, though most survivors did suffer extreme and permanent injuries. And by contrast, Unit 731 and related Japanese human experimentation units had no survivors, as they wanted no witnesses, and there were, of course, survivors of the biological weapon attacks on Chinese cities, but none who were held in laboratory prisons ever escaped. The different methodological approaches reflect different strategic goals for each entity, with Nazi experiments having 3 primary pursuits: military survival, with tests related to hypothermia survival, safe altitudes to deploy parachutes, and making seawater drinkable; drugs and treatments, with testing pharmaceuticals developed to fight contagions such as malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, as well as testing antidotes to gas attacks; plus the obvious advancement of racial and ideological goals, with experiments testing sterilization techniques, trying to find the cheapest and fastest way to conduct mass sterilizations against those they saw as inferior. Unit 731 concentrated almost exclusively on biological weapons development, maintaining monthly production capacities that could contaminate entire cities. And while both programs conducted vivisection and hypothermia experiments, Unit 731's systematic deployment of biological weapons against civilian populations through 26 facilities across Asia represented a scale of field testing completely unmatched by the Nazi programs. Josef Mengelé's experiments at Auschwitz on hundreds, if not over 1,000 sets of twins focused on racial pseudoscience and genetic research, often preserving specimens for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Sigmund Rascher's hypothermia experiments at Dachau, involving 280 to 300 victims with 90 deaths, tested survival limits for downed Luftwaffe pilots. Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann's sterilization experiments on men and women at Auschwitz sought efficient methods for racial genocide. But even these demonstrably horrific programs pale beside Unit 731's industrial-scale biological weapons production and testing on entire civilian populations. That's not to say that the Japanese were the worst offenders of human rights violations during this time, as this was an era of warfare where non-combatants and civilian populations weren't viewed as off-limits for attacks, not just by Axis forces, but also by Allied forces with the firebombing of Japanese cities by, the American Air Force. Germany turned London to ruins during the London Blitz as it dropped 12,000 metric tons of bombs on the civilian centers over 8 months, killing 30,000 civilians. Germany also pursued ethnic cleansing in all of the territory they occupied, not to mention the starvation of Christians and the Ukrainians from the Soviet Union and the gulags. I mean, everybody was bad, seems like, guys. Anyways, this video is about Unit 731 though, and Japan attacked Chinese cities with biological weapons and planned attacks on United States cities. Japan also committed mass killings during their invasion of China and conducted air raids, killing thousands of civilians in Chongqing. The rape of Nanking is a perfect example of just the pure evil from the Japanese Empire. As for the UK and US, they bombed numerous German cities in a combined bomber offensive that killed over 305,000 total and wounded another 780,000. The US, also famously known for their atomic bombs and dropping them, dropped those atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki civilian centers, killing hundreds of thousands of people, civilians, innocent people, in immediate blasts and over time from resulting injuries. Then the Soviet Union conducted ethnic cleansing, mass deportation, starvation of Christians, Ukrainians, and so on and so forth, deportation operations. This resulted in many deaths that we'll never know the true numbers of. In all honesty, the Soviet Union is notorious for undocumented killings and mass murder. There are apparent differences between the objectives of the Japanese and the Nazi Germany experiment. Both resulted in unimaginable human suffering with clearly evil people on both sides, but perhaps the most extreme difference between the Nazi and Japanese medical war crimes lies in their post-war treatment. This is what gets me very fired up. You may have heard of the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg doctors' trial from December 1946 to August 1947 prosecuted 23 defendants for medical war crimes, resulting in 7 death sentences, which were executed on June 2nd, 1948, 5 life imprisonments, and the establishing of the Nuremberg Code as the modern foundation of modern medical ethics.
And that defendant Phelps, in his official capacity, repeatedly insisted on supervision over and full responsibility and credit for the experiment.
The Nuremberg proceedings lasted 140 days with extensive documentation, survivor testimony, and international publicity that exposed Nazi medical crimes to global condemnation. In contrast, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which was a trial that ran from 1946 to 1948, made only one vague reference to poisonous serums, which were then dismissed for a lack of evidence despite US intelligence possessing comprehensive documentation of Unit 731's activities. Beginning in 1941 and through 1943, the US had begun capturing Japanese documentation on Unit 731, and we became aware of the following: the Japanese use of biological warfare resulting in outbreaks of plague and cholera, personnel and locations involved in biological warfare organizations operating under the names Water Supply and Purification Units, we knew that, plus the knowledge of Shiraishi's research facilities in Manchuria. And in 1944, intelligence gathering revealed the production of bacteria in Japan and Manchuria to be used in biological warfare, as well as the research being conducted at the Pingfan facility operated by Unit 731. However, when Japan surrendered and war crimes trial preparations and investigations began, it was stated that there was no evidence of biological warfare experiments occurring, likely because Ishii and other scientists within the program destroyed most of the unit's records at the end of the war as Japan's defeat seemed imminent. But like we said, the research shows they had been aware of what was happening in Japan, gathering documentation and compiling reports for years ahead of the Japanese surrender in late 1945. So how could they call these claims vague or uncorroborated? Perhaps they were willingly ignorant and saw an opportunity if they just looked the other way. America did not concern itself with what had happened to Chinese civilians and POWs only the fates of personnel within the Allied powers. They stated as much in a draft warning to all Japanese, which is this here. It's quoted as saying, "The Japanese government on many occasions has publicly and solemnly declared to the nations and people of the world that it accords prisoners of war and civilian internees good and humane treatment. If at the end of hostilities it is found that Japanese authorities have not safeguarded from harm or have willfully exposed to danger the Allied personnel in their keeping, and the solemn declarations of the Japanese government are thereby proved to have been without foundation, the Allied governments declare that any individual, regardless of position or status, guilty of having permitted starvation and death or having permitted the maltreatment of any Allied prisoners of war, internees, or citizens, whether in battle zone or lines of communication, in a camp, hospital, prison, or elsewhere, will be ruthlessly pursued and brought to punishment." This is the firm and fixed intentions of the Allied governments. So, there were no punishments. Were there Allied POWs who were subjected to these experiments? There were still no punishments. On May 5th, 1945, the United States Army Air Force and the 20th Air Force flew missions 144, 145, and 147 to 149. And these missions had the crews of 55 B-29s bombing Japanese airfields at Oita, Tachiari, Kanoya, and Chiran. There's a 0% chance that I got those right, but anyways. 3 B-29s were lost on that mission, and one of which is a B-29A 42-65305, which was shot down, and the 12 airmen had to bail out. Reportedly, all but 4 crew members survived, and they all landed in various locations. One died in the fall after the cords of his parachute were sliced by another Japanese plane, and 3 died at the crash site after being surrounded by angry mobs. One allegedly opened fire on villagers before committing suicide. 8 of these crewmen were transported to Kyushu Imperial University's medical department, and if you remember, Unit 731 had connections to medical schools where they sourced doctors and researchers for their programs, and the B-29 crew was led to believe they were going to receive treatment for their injuries, but they were subjected to some of the same experiments that were conducted on Chinese prisoners in Manchuria. Dr. Toshio Tono, who was president for these experiments as a medical assistant, was an outspoken critic of what happened, as he tried to ensure that what had happened to these U.S. airmen is not forgotten. The first crewman to be operated on was Teddy J. Ponska, the B-29's flight engineer, and according to Dr. Tono, Teddy had believed that he was going to be treated. Still, the operating doctor, wanting to test something in regard to effects on a respiratory system, removed a lung before stitching him shut. Following the lung removal, Teddy was reportedly injected intravenously with seawater to determine if it was a viable substitute for sterile saline solution, with Dr. Tono being the one who held the bottle of seawater, witnessing Tony bleed to death. Other airmen had parts of their organs removed, and a drill was used to cut into the skull of a live prisoner, and part of the brain was removed to see if that could treat epilepsy. Part of one airman's liver was removed to see if survival was possible, but all of the Americans who were experimented on died, just like everyone else in Unit 731 who was experimented on. There were no survivors. The bodies of the American airmen were even preserved in formaldehyde so that future anatomy students could study them. Still, at the end of the war, doctors had records destroyed and bodies were quickly cremated in an attempt to hide all the evidence of their war crimes. When asked where these airmen went after the war, they told Americans that they had been sent to prison camps in Hiroshima where they died in the atomic blasts, which is a really weird thing to lie about. And circling back to the War Crimes Tribunal we had begun to cover earlier, one might think that it would just make sense to try everyone who had participated in these crimes against humanity at the same time and just put them to the sword for what they did and just get it over with, just like had been done with the German war criminals put to death for their human experiments, but that is not what happened at all. You see, like we briefly mentioned earlier, there was an opportunity here. Massive opportunity. Japan's testing had resulted in the accumulation of valuable medical data, and the US government and scientific community wanted to get their fucking grubby ass hands on it, so they struck a deal. Not a single member of Unit 731 would face prosecution, and at the same time, perpetrators of the experiments on American POWs would be tried separately at another tribunal in Yokohama to separate the two incidents, allowing for an immunity deal to be arranged with those who hadn't experimented on Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, a microbiologist with America's Military Center for Biological Weapons, was sent to Japan to investigate, and he learned of Unit 731 after threatening to involve the Soviets in the legal process, which was something that Shiro Ishii and the other Japanese doctors wished to avoid entirely. The thing was, Colonel Sanders was also being manipulated during his interrogations of Unit 731 members. They had told him that the Japanese military engaged solely in defensive research, as biological warfare was clearly against humanity, but his translator, Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Naito, had been a part of Unit 731 and was steering the conversation. One such lie that Naito told was that they had kept the scale of research small because the Emperor didn't like the Japanese Army or Navy preparing chemical warfare, which we know is completely false, given his explicit approval of Unit 731. And expanding upon this lie, he stated that they insisted on not pursuing offensive preparation and work was purely defensive, which once again, complete bullshit, not true at all. We know that they didn't do the research with defensive motivations, even though that potentially could have been a valid argument if they'd meant it, considering the fact that America was the only other power that didn't sign the 1925 Geneva Protocol. So the insinuation was that the Japanese were studying biological warfare to defensively fight back against us potentially using biological warfare, which we did have some plans to use biological warfare against Japanese-controlled islands. For example, at one point it was suggested that ahead of the invasion of Japanese-controlled islands, Batulani could be dropped over them to debilitate or kill defenders so that resistance would be minimal. It could also be used against warships and logistics targets, and the Americans elaborated on how to manufacture Batulani, acknowledging the criticism that the use of it would be inhumane. And check this out. The author argues that if anything, it's more humane than traditional weapons as it causes no pain or tissue injury. Chances are that most of the victims would get a sublethal dose. They would be made ill, but most of them would recover without treatment. What an awesome way to look at biological warfare. By the way, that's a thought out plan from Americans to use biological weapons against our enemies. So, you know, in terms of them wanting to use it only defensively, it's kind of a strange broad stroke. Everybody's bad though. It seems like Colonel Sanders brought the information to the attention of General Douglas MacArthur, who was the man responsible for rebuilding post-war Japan under Allied occupation, with the recommendation that they grant members immunity in exchange for their research. And this was a feeling echoed by many who considered what kind of information the Japanese doctors and researchers may hold, revealing that while American scientists observed ethical boundaries and wouldn't cross them themselves, the work was still valuable. The Hill-Victor report from 1947 was written by Dr. Edwin V. Hill and Dr. Joseph Victor, and in the report they state, "Such information could not be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. It is hoped that the individuals who voluntarily contributed this information will be spared embarrassment because of it, and that every effort will be taken to prevent this information from falling into other hands." At least from the German side, there was a little bit of justice served, but there was absolutely none, in spite of the scruples. They acknowledged that because America's scientific and medical community views human experimentation as unethical, we can't obtain these results, but Japanese researchers didn't view it the same way. They believed that they should be spared the embarrassment of being exposed by using the opportunity to gain the information for ourselves before another nation does. It also seemed that considering the budget alone, they would be fools not to take advantage of the opportunity to learn from Japan's big money research. They'd spent tens of millions of yen conducting their experiments, and meanwhile, the US had only spent 250,000 yen over the course of its investigation. MacArthur followed these recommendations and granted them immunity from prosecution, including Shiroishi, if they provided America and only America with their data from human experimentation. There were 8,000 slides of tissue from human and animal dissections, along with 600 plus pages of articles covering the field of their work, and another 100 plus pages related to the biological and chemical warfare that they were testing. And we continued to turn a blind eye when faced with anything that might make us uncomfortable or raise concerns. Despite apparent discrepancies between the Unit 731 researchers' claims and the results they presented, they continued to take them at their word. You see, Unit 731 claimed the human subjects that were used for experiments were criminals who had been condemned to death, and since the US saw no evidence to indicate the statement was untrue, everything was cool. The thing was, they only sent 2 lawyers to investigate claims of biological attacks in China. While they interviewed physicians who had reported on the plague outbreaks, they didn't interview any victims and had no mandate to conduct an intensive field study. So when they reported to MacArthur that the evidence is not sufficient to justify the charge of bacterial warfare, they just went along with it. And Unit 731 members claimed that no American or Russian POWs had been used aside from the blood of some American POWs to check antibody content, and the US saw no evidence to indicate the statement was untrue, or what's more likely, they just refused to see the evidence because it would look bad. And they really wanted all this research. The State War Navy Coordinating Committee's August 1st, 1947 report justified this arrangement by concluding that the value of Japanese BW information outweighed war crimes prosecution. But not for the Germans, of course. Key U.S. officials orchestrating the cover-up included General Charles A. Willoughby, which was MacArthur's intelligence chief who actively suppressed prosecution efforts and advocated for Ishii's pardon while protecting another 24 scientists from war crime prosecution. Dr. Norbert Fell of the Chemical Warfare Service conducted detailed investigations while ensuring findings remained classified, and the decision reflected Cold War calculations prioritizing potential military advantage over actual justice and morals and ethics, etc., with officials arguing that preventing Soviet access to biological warfare data justified protecting war criminals. And when Soviets would request access to Ishii and Unit 731 staff for their own investigations into Japan's alleged war crimes, the United States viewed providing intelligence to them as potentially jeopardizing the security of the US, and Ishii was instructed by the US not to divulge valuable information to the Soviets given its perceived value. Horribly ironically, later evaluations determined that the data, which had been seen at the time as immeasurably valuable, did not meet American expectations, and what was produced was at best of minor significance, making this moral compromise ultimately worthless, even from a utilitarian perspective, even from the perspective of Paul Blart. I mean, I don't know, a psycho. Not Paul Blart. But hey, at least they tried those responsible for the human experimentation on American airmen at Kyushu Imperial University separately so they could face justice, right, because of their own words. No. Stanford has collected documents related to many of the cases brought forward in the Yokohama Tribunal, which sought to prosecute Japanese leaders and all systems of society for the atrocities committed against Allied prisoners of war. And it wasn't just restricted to those who were tortured at Kyushu University. It was for all POWs who died in captivity during the war, of which 90% of American POWs who died did so while in Japanese captivity in their prison camps or prison ships. And regarding just what happened to those involved in the murder of the crew of that B-29, which were 30 Kyushu University doctors and military staff, they stood trial, and 23 of those 30 were convicted of vivisection and the removal of body parts. And of those 23, 5 received death sentences and 4 received life in prison. The wheels of justice are slow moving, but a lot can happen in a few short years, so that's fortunate. Nowadays, death row inmates can spend decades between their sentencing and execution, if you guys didn't know that. But wait! In 1952, Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, would sign Executive Order 10393, which would undo the prosecution of those doctors who had experimented on American POWs. Why? Japan had requested clemency, sentence reduction, or parole for war criminals convicted by the US during the various World War II war crime tribunals and with the looming Cold War. The Korean War was a significant escalation in the ideological differences between the Soviet Union and China supporting the North versus Western powers like the United States supporting the South. And an ally was obviously needed, and Japan could be that ally. Japan was granted sovereignty again when the Treaty of San Francisco ended the Allied occupation of the island nation as they entered into a security alliance allowing US troops to remain stationed in Japan. And in 1958, all Japanese prisoners serving war crimes related sentences were paroled. So, if your grandfather was vivisected by a Japanese scientist, he was at least paroled in 1958. So, parole's pretty rough. And by the way, many Unit 731 veterans achieved remarkable success in post-war Japan. Masaji Kitano co-founded a Green Cross pharmaceutical company in 1950, becoming its director and chief executive until 1986. Epic. And coincidentally, Ryoichi Naito, the translator who facilitated the dealings between Unit 731 and the US, and had also been a member of Unit 731, was a founder of Green Cross as well. Yoshimura Hisato, who conducted the frostbite experiments, became the chair of the Japan Meteorological Society before becoming president of Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. Others rose to positions including the governor of Tokyo, president of the Japanese Medical Association, and head of the Japanese Olympic Committee. Even the man behind it all, Shiro Ishii, had a short-lived private practice before he died of throat cancer in 1959. The world largely doesn't even know what Unit 731, and it seems Japan is content to keep it that way. Speaking about it is to point out one of the country's greatest shames that is still denied in a lot of ways, both then and now. And the Chinese still have not gotten justice. It's unbelievable. When Unit 731 members first began speaking about their research to Americans, even when they were cooperating, they spoke among themselves saying, "We are not supposed to talk about this." And that is the mentality ever since, it seems. On top of Dr. Tono speaking out about his experience with the American POWs that were experimented on in Kyushu Imperial University, a former Unit 731 member, Hideo Shimizu, has been outspoken since 2015, but he discovered that honesty doesn't win you any favors. Hideo was only 14 years old when he joined Unit 731 in 1945 and wouldn't be there for long, as the end of the war was approaching fast. But what he saw during that time left him with nightmares ever since. There was a specimen room filled with jars containing human organs, limbs, and even heads. He saw a pregnant woman in a large jar with a fetus protruding from her flayed side. Thankfully for Hideo, the job that awaited him and all he'd been told about didn't last for longer than 6 months. Even though all he did was take care of rats, he still feels guilty for having any part in what happened. He returned to the site of the event, visiting the memorial and revisiting his memories from that time to apologize for his involvement. His apology was appreciated and even celebrated by China, with some acknowledgement finally being given of the crimes against humanity. But Japan felt differently when their countrymen started spilling the beans. His daughters have cut ties with him, politicians don't want him speaking, and people slander him online, calling him a liar and a traitor. Most in Japan would rather not acknowledge this part of their past, if not even dismiss it entirely, which is unbelievable. But Voices of America, who interviewed Hideo Shimizu, also visited a local museum dedicated to remembering World War II and revealed a small area dedicated to Unit 731, where they say that research is ongoing and society has many different opinions about the unit. Museums and governments would rather paint a prettier picture of the past than the gruesome and disturbing real version, in which an increasingly smaller generation of people remember living through. By the way, it seems as though our incumbent government currently is trying to pressure the Smithsonian from detailing the darker side of America's history with slavery, which is classic, I guess. There have been acknowledgments of Unit 731 by Japanese officials and institutions, of course, but there has never been a formal apology issued for what happened, which is why Hideo Shimizu is speaking out and ruffling so many feathers. Unit 731 and its post-war exoneration from guilt and consequence further prove that it doesn't matter how evil something is, there will always be someone who can try to justify it and someone who will listen to that and maybe take that research, use it elsewhere. As a wise man once said, "Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he's created?" Anyways, thank you for watching. Hopefully you guys learned something about Unit 731. And if you did, press the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'll see you all in the next one. Go to the Gump Club to see uncensored videos. There's not going to be really anything in regard. I'm not a good salesman. I'm sorry. Sour GG, support the channel. If you want to see stuff, I don't really care. Doesn't matter. This video is crazy. Learn history, but like the good kind of history. Don't learn what you're told, actually do research. Like try to find things and put the pieces together and use your rational brain and try to notice things that are interesting to you and go down the rabbit hole yourself and yada, yada, yada.